Good afternoon. Welcome, disaster and emergency managers. Welcome to Hazardscape Live. We are live streaming today from Edmonton, Alberta, and we are going to get started in just a minute with Ken Letander. He is an emergency management coordinator, and we'll get talking soon. Just to start off, we've got some good shows lined up coming between July and August. We're going to have author of Public Speaking for Dummies, Allison Connolly, on. That's going to be a super fun show. We're going to go through some public speaking warm-ups and get into a little bit of back and forth about how to warm up. We're also going to have emergency social services for autism, and we're going to be talking to Dominique Chabot from Autism Canada about how to set up emergency social services plans and evacuee centers and reception centers a little bit more friendly for those with autism or those on the spectrum. So those will be coming up shortly. So without, let's see, I'm going to see if Ken's get on here, but we're going to get started and we will be right back with All right, so I'm not sure if, Ken popped off. Let's see if we can get him back. This is the joys of live streaming. So Ken, I think, just fell off from the live stream. We're going to try and get him back here in just a sec, see if he gets back logged in, and I'm going to check my messages. So, yeah, like I was saying, we're going to have Allison Connolly on coming this month, next month, Autism Canada. And I'm really trying to hopefully get Simon Wells on from the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management as they do their July release. So stay tuned for that. If you or your organization would, like to pop on to Hazardscape Live and have a discussion with me or be part of a panel, just contact me at Brad Eisen at hazardscape.com, brad.eisen at hazardscape.com. And I'd be happy to chat with you. All right, Ken is popping back on. And we'll see if he shoots up here with his video. There he is. All right, Ken, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I disconnected there for a moment,
All right, awesome. That's all good. That's the fun of live streaming. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming on today. Really appreciate your time. I know you are very busy right now, just not only with normal work. You've got a speaker series going on, and I mean you're in emergency management. We're in full swing with hazards and a heat wave and COVID and all that stuff. So I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's give a little breakdown just of your experience with emergency management and kind of what you do and where you are today, so people can kind of just get a quick idea of who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So a number of years ago when I worked with the province, I worked on part of the Southern Alberta Flood Recovery Task Force, or task team, and there was a few of us left part of the recovery phase. So a lot in grant management, funding. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, okay, I've just got you on solo screen so we can get get your full view of you.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And so we're looking at a little more of policy process, how to ensure that communities are receiving the best customer service from government and from organizations. And so more recently, now I'm in this position over here with the Confederacy. And so again, working on those processes, trying to increase personal capabilities and capacity within communities. I always say that they are the experts, and so I'm not going to teach someone how to do their jobs. They could probably teach me a lot more than what I know in the theories. However, there's processes that we're working together to kind of really flush out and develop that capacity. So when there is crisis after crisis, there's actually those processes that are there and mechanisms to support communities.
Awesome. And so if you're just joining us, I don't know, did I say your last name correctly? Letander?
Yeah, that's
Letander? Yeah, okay. If you're just tuning in, we're with Kenneth Letander. He's emergency management coordinator with the Treaty 6 Confederation. We're going to be talking today about Indigenous engagement and policy in the context of emergency management. So let's kind of get into that. What are, in your experiences, like some of the differences around policy and emergency management for Indigenous communities versus municipalities, and how does that policy development cycle work within the Indigenous context? I assume it's a little bit the same, but I don't want to assume that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess it really you have to look at the jurisdiction. So First Nation have a relationship with the government of Canada, sort of where the funding comes from to cover off emergencies. And so each community has a disaster emergency manager or someone that works in that capacity. And so they're working with Indigenous Services Canada on an ongoing basis. They work with Alberta Emergency Management Agency here in Alberta. And so they'll have those relationships with the field liaisons. Now, in terms of where there's differences, significant differences, is within the world of insurance. So it's a little more difficult for a community member, an individual household owner or property owner, to get insurance at a kind of more fair market rate, what maybe you could get here in Edmonton or in Calgary. There's a little more risk involved. There's challenges. Some insurers and underwriters won't touch First Nation communities in terms of liability and in terms of just personal content insurance. So there are some companies out there now moving more into that space, which is really good. So that with more people in that space, the price for insurance is able to come down. But then also you have to factor in with a policy like that, if maybe you lived in Calgary or Edmonton, your insurance provider could start the recovery process with you a little quicker. Whereas in this case, communities are really reliant on their relationship with the province and with the federal government.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that's something I remember from my disaster recovery days is, insurance was never available for overland flooding anywhere, let alone, I think, in a First Nation community versus a municipality. So what is your role in that kind of process of trying to bring in the insurance providers to provide better options or support for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the speakers we had was Dr. Ilan Noy from New Zealand, who spoke about insurance and some of their experiences working in Christchurch in New Zealand, and some of the challenges people who didn't have insurance and those who did. And if you're above a certain financial threshold, you get better service. And we've seen that through some publications in the States. Here in Alberta, some of the ways that we're trying to open up those conversations and facilitate those opportunities is just through public learning and engagement. And so having people who work in that space who can answer those tough questions. And I've had one of the folks speak to another Indigenous community, and there was a lot of surprise in terms of even the company will facilitate and cover personal property insurance, so artwork and regalia, whereas a lot of, like I said, you can't really put a price on that. And so there's people who do that. So it's just creating those platforms. So sometimes, as I was looking at some of the scenarios and situations where companies approach communities and say, here's what we can offer. Some other companies before them have, did the same approach, but then either didn't follow up, maybe just didn't even deliver a service. So there's a lot of skepticism out there, which was rightfully so. And so companies have to, really find new ways to engage and market to First Nation communities in order to create those opportunities.
What are some really good examples that you're seeing in terms of that engagement? Like, is it going really, really well with a particular sector, and kind of what are they doing to help that?
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't name the specific company, but in terms of in terms of engagement, I think a lot of folks are now starting to realize you need to have that human approach, that just that being a good person and being personable to a company and taking their phone call. And so it's always nice for communities, and not just First Nation communities, but if you know someone who works in government or a company, you don't have to dial a switchboard and talk to a robot. You have a direct contact. So people opening up those channels and saying, you can give me a call when you need to. And so really facilitating those relationships. And I think industry is getting to that point, and maybe a lot of people already did it, but more people are now starting to kind of embrace that personal relationships for companies to First Nation communities. And so kind of going in there and saying, you know, this is what we know, and this is the knowledge that we have access to and resources, but what is it that you need? And so versus going there and saying, like, this is what you're going to take from us, more of what's your needs, and so what should we not do? And so asking those types of questions, you know, even there's kind of the cultural courses 101, and so, you know, but even just asking communities, should we not go to houses? Which houses should we not go to? Do we need to have someone from the community go knock at the door first before just showing up? And so, you know, just having that more engagement with community liaisons, and we've seen that in recovery, where a company has been, you know, set up shop, is working on repairing homes, and then goes to a house and said, well, here, I'm here to fix your house today. And the person says, you know, you need to leave my property and leave my house. I don't know you. Because, you know, you don't really know if it's just someone working for a construction company from off reserve. Some person shows up and says, I'm here to fix your house. I mean, I can tell you someone said that to me and showed up at my door today and said, I'm here to fix your furnace. And I would easily tell them just to leave because I didn't call them.
Yeah. And so if you're online, if you've got questions or comments, please post them and we'll get them on. So you said a couple of things there that kind of rang true for me, because like in Canada and in the provinces and territories, we spend a lot of time and investment helping companies localize themselves in a new market, especially in the international world. So how do I get my products to market in Japan? Well, here's the cultural requirements. Here's what you should have on your website. You should have a language setting that goes to Japanese, and like Export Development Canada does a lot of work with that. I would expect that it would go a long way for an organization to kind of look at how do we localize our products and services with either within the treaty we're in or the province we're in with those First Nations, by offering, like you said, some of those insights into how do I approach the community. Should there be things on our website and within our culture and phone calls that makes it feel a little bit more like home to those we're working with?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest stressors I say to everyone, when you're doing a marketing strategy, I mean, and I'll just say kind of the Western world and indigenous world, and there's always a high standard for marketing, like you said, to different countries and even marketing to different interest groups. And so what I find in terms of, if you kind of look at it from a customer service lens, and so you're going to do X, Y, Z to really get your product showcased. And then when you work with communities, they're sometimes not the same interest to saying, well, we need to really focus on marketing and graphics and colors. And even, you know, I've seen some places where if they know the leadership, they just say, okay, we're gonna have a meeting. And it could be everyone gets noticed 2 hours prior to that. Well, that's not really respectful in my opinion. People need to have advance notice. They need to be engaged. And so kind of taking those same marketing values you might use in the Western world and applying them to communities. So finding what kind of colors would benefit them or make it a little more catchy. What type of language. And really, one thing what I've said to government folks, especially now in this role, I've been to a lot of engagement sessions, and so I've been requested to go and listen. And I've said clearly to government officials, why am I here, and what's the outcome? And you know, they said, you know, in different capacities, why do you think you're here? I'm quite busy. I don't wear 5 different hats like some of the emergency managers that work in the communities. So I have a little more luxury to be there and kind of flush out why I'm there. But you know, what I've said, you know, next time you do an engagement session, give me something that looks a lot like a briefing note. The who,
Yeah.
what, why, what's the problem, and why are we here, and what are your options, or what are the solutions you're looking at achieving, and share that with us before these sessions. I've attended other sessions where they've asked the same questions, like where do the indigenous people fit on in the world of climate change and solutions? And I've said, you have data, you have access to research. People have done literally, activities and wrote proposals. Why don't you look at those? And sure, engage with us, but look at the data that you already have instead of coming here and having people brainstorm about the stuff that you could actually research first. So, coming prepared versus just having these conversations for the sake of just saying you engaged. People are, like I said, people are busy. One of the challenges I have, even in my role, in regardless if I'm indigenous or not, you need to build trust with people, and so I need to respect that the person I'm working with has 5 or more hats, and that means they're working 3 to 4 different full-time jobs all at once, and so being respectful of their time, and just because they might not be the tribal manager or an elected official, they are busy, and so I have to respect their time, make things brief, quick to the point. And at the same time, if I'm selling something, and for anyone, if you're selling an idea or a vision, you have to let them know what's in it for them. How will this benefit their position? How will it make it easy or for them to focus on their other portfolios? So really kind of fleshing out what's going to be in it for someone to even attend a meeting, a community meeting. What are their deliverables? I mean, we all have our own deliverables, what we want to achieve. But if we're inviting people to these engagement sessions or community meetings, even if you work in the community, what is the person's deliverable? Kind of, and that's a customer service approach.
Yeah. And yeah, again, another thing. So a lot of this has been on my mind over the last few weeks, and you kind of alluded to it again. You kind of said, they're trying to, what are they trying to take from you, or what are they trying to get from you? And it's this idea of extraction. Like as a Western culture, we've extracted pretty much all of the salmon out of the sea on the East Coast. We've extracted pretty much all of, a lot of the culture and language out of the indigenous communities. We've extracted a lot of our resources out of our land. And yeah, but I guess, that kind of came up with me, like asking, what is your purpose for being here, and what is your reason for being here? Again, that's that idea of extraction and extracting from you, as opposed to creating that environment where you know what's going on. And two, the other thing you kind of pointed out was around that triggered me kind of was that regalia piece. Because when I was in DRP, like we had to fight with the federal government and the DFAA to allow our disaster financial assistance program in Alberta to pay for damaged regalia. And I remember back in the day when people would call it costumes, and it's not a costume. It's their living, it's their culture, it's their traditional way of life, and that is essential. And so that's why, and if for those tuning in, I asked Ken if we could talk a little bit about Treaty 6 and the treaties and emergency management context. And the reason I brought that up is because, some of that stuff is in the treaties. The Treaty 6, there's a lot of obligations from the federal government to the First Nations. And, nowhere in our guidelines or DRP policy was there ever any mention to any of the items within the treaties. That was one of the points we used to kind of get it back into the financial assistance guidelines, is like we have obligation through the treaties, like it is essential. It's an essential good. And I hope the insurance companies kind of look at that too.
Yeah, I mean, after at a certain point, I think more insurance companies, starting to kind of work in that space will begin to have more of an open mind. And I'm sure there's a lot of really good staff capacity already that have a foundational understanding, but I think it's just making the content a little more easy to understand. I mean, you can look at the treaties on Government of Canada, and I'm sure it's just full of content. But how do you make that accessible? And that's why I'm a big advocate for turning any content, and you can piece it together and turn it into a briefing note for people to skim and have a general understanding. One of the projects we're working on is looking at the Indigenous Services Canada funding model for communities. So you kind of have 3 streams where communities are independent, and depending on how, I guess we'll just, for the sake of terminology, we'll use performance and reporting. And if they sort of maybe they're not reporting the way that the federal government would like, then they get a co-manager. And then if that isn't working out, that model, then they go to third-party default management. And they have a new name called expert resource worker. And so, taking a policy like that and dissecting it and looking at, obviously, some people would say there's pros and some people would say cons, but looking at that and turning that into a briefing note. So just start generating that awareness and just discussions. I mean, there's people in government who've worked in consultation who've never heard of that. And so when you have that discussion, it's news, right? Because if you were to look at a large city like Edmonton and say, well, Edmonton can't manage their funds, so then we're appointing a federal government contractor or something like that to manage all of the funds for the city. That's very similar to what happens with communities. So when there's a disaster, that person if they're in that third-party management, has to be aware of how funds are flowing, because funds may flow from the province and may not flow directly from the federal government at that time. So it's developing that capacity, but also, just having those simple discussions. And part of the speaker series that we've been hosting is just to say that, we don't have the solutions, but let's just have the discussions. And out of that, teams and different groups and companies and government can take that information and start having that discussion and connecting with community colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Sarah, for your question. So what are some other blind spots or areas that we haven't addressed that we need to be looking at in the context of EM? I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but Ken, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the question, Sarah. I really appreciate it. So one of the blind spots, so when I think about capacity development and I think about programming, and I've said this too in a discussion with another First Nation disaster emergency manager, because they're, at first it was like, well, what can you do for me, and what are you trying to do to, for us? And so they've met people, they've met consultants, they've met academics, they've met government people who all, come through with a solution, the next greatest solution to sell. And so, one of the things I said, well, what is it that you need? And you're like, well, you guess. And so, through some simple dialogue, and what I heard was, we're programmed out. We've had so many programs, we've had so much training, we know how to pull people out of a fire. We work with AEMA here in Alberta. We have our field liaison. You can't teach me something that I can get from that service provider over there, and I respect that. One of the gaps in terms of I'm just looking at the question here again. The blind spots is understanding there may not be as many formal processes within communities. Every community may have their own different process, their governance model. For their disaster emergency managers, but just simple things like deliverables. So when I leave the conversation, I want to leave them with something, or even done working on a project. And so not just saying, here, we got a workshop, we hit our deliverable, I hit a success mark and I can report that to my boss. I want to leave tangible documents and processes and guides, and not just these guides for creating another guide and putting onto the file cabinet and calling it a win, but project management documents, project management processes, risk mitigation templates, everything like that, social media templates, because like I said, some of those disaster emergency managers and their teams are really busy. We just had a workshop yesterday with a speaker who people flocked to, in my opinion. And so, it was just more of a closed session with a community. And, we're dealing with internet issues. People, they have meetings, and there's other pressing crisis. So people have to leave meetings, and so you can't sit through the entire thing just because of something else. So we're trying to create those processes, like example, like decision documents, EM succession planning. And so those are, I think, in my opinion, that's what's been missing. It's a blind spot. We haven't considered all the other facets. And emergency managers, like I said, they are busy, and that's the one thing I can stress the most. And they don't have time to always train someone new. They don't have the luxury of time like maybe some other people do in different organizations in the city. And so if we can sort of start looking and asking communities, what do you need? What kind of processes do you need? Do you need some support with policy development? Everything from even roles and responsibilities. And so again, like people are programmed out, they've received a lot of training and a lot of theory. And so now here's the physical tools that people can use down the road. I think that would be one. Another one, what I would say for a blind spot, and I was just mentioning this yesterday, it's not so much a decolonization concept, but government wants to work with elected officials, chief and council. One thing in my experience working with chief and council, as effective as they are in having that decision power over processes, there's a lot of community knowledge that hasn't been tapped into. And so I've been there in the middle of everything. And so one of the ways that in order to start having effective communication was I started working with grandmothers of the community and mothers. And so we often forget the power of grandmothers in communities. They are they have a lot of influence. If you want to talk about social media influencers, grandmothers are the traditional influencers of their communities. So really working with grandmothers, working with the elders, and to understand what they say. They live it, they've seen it. And so I would say certainly that. I would also encourage anyone who's working with First Nation communities and to talk about marketing again, talk about websites, talk about the importance of good, clean content on a website. Maybe there's social media, Facebook and Twitter, which is also just as effective, but having one centralized location. And so when we talk about the blind spots, I always say it's a website. When there's a disaster and government's looking for something, have that content on the website. People don't always go to Facebook or even have Facebook accounts. So, really, I think government could support communities in sort of just saying, let's work together and collaborate on some of the communication strategies that you could use or implement if you see it fit. I really hope I answered that question properly.
Yeah, that would I'm glad that this is getting recorded because there was a ton of really good stuff in there. And I think for me, at the heart of that is just listen. Go into a First Nation community and just listen. And you're going to get tons of great information like you just got right now. So Shauna, I'll put up Shauna's question here. And it's really centered around, do you think that First Nation communities being listed as vulnerable is a type of wrong label? And how do we balance acknowledging the chronic crisis within our communities when we're with Indigenous communities and working with them to be both respectful and helpful? So kind of a two-part question there. But yeah, I would imagine being labeled as vulnerable is too broad because I would agree not all communities are probably vulnerable in that in a vulnerable definition.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think and I'm going to probably answer that maybe in just a different way, and I always have a little bit of a story, maybe how I get to my answer here. One of the things I always say is government and different consulting companies, they look at communities and say they need an economic development solution and a strategy. So let's see what the community is. And the community says, okay, well, we have they'll maybe go with a gas station, for example, some low-hanging fruit. And just for reference. And so then, the outside world says, well, that's really great. They have a gas station, there's economic, it's development, there's jobs, there's people coming in and purchasing items and goods. And then they're kind of like, well, then everyone should just share the resources and everyone benefits, like a co-op model. And I've had the discussion before with someone, and they've say just the person maybe they don't have as much knowledge within First Nation communities, and they say, well, the communities have those lots of opportunities. And I said, well, yeah, there's opportunities, but I said, could you imagine you in your neighborhood, right where you live in the city, having the next 100 people on your block say that they build a co-op gas station and everyone gets a benefit from it? And so, and I expect everyone to get along. And no, not everyone's going to get along. There's always differences, and you see that on every board and committee that you've been on in the past. People have opinions and they have differences and different solutions. So I would say, and so then people kind of look at First Nation communities as, oh, well, they're dysfunctional and they're problematic, and look, they're always fighting, and some of the rumors and stereotypes that just have grown over the years. And when you look at it from a city and just a regular city block, those exact issues would exist in that city block if you told everyone to get along. You can't even get people to get along on a condo board, and so in the same building. And so, then we start looking at Indigenous communities as vulnerable, and they're always fighting, and there's always these challenges. And so when you kind of put things into perspective, those challenges exist in a lot of other places. So being deemed as vulnerable, or what was the term we used here? Vulnerable.
Yeah, vulnerable.
I think it probably is a challenge. I mean, people have capacities. Are they vulnerable? Maybe, in terms of a community aspect, that maybe road access. Yeah, if there's one road in and it's it could be flooded at any given time or washed out. Well, yeah, then in that case, the community is vulnerable from an infrastructure, or else maybe there's the power lines are built in or now in swamps. So yeah, from an infrastructure, road access or water access, yeah, vulnerable in that aspect. But that would be the same vulnerability for a community, a small municipality town just outside of Edmonton, if there was one road in and one road out. And so that would be one of the things I would say. They wouldn't be vulnerable, but in terms of what I've seen before is, an ample amount of resilience, and not just using resilience as a key term or a buzzword, but in terms of people during disasters, they want to come together and they want to help. And so with that said, there is a lot of community collaboration in the middle of a disaster. So people will, they will get along, they will come, they will help out their neighbors and help put out fires or rescue people from fires and floods. But yeah, deeming one particular group as vulnerable, I think, is something that we certainly need to move away from. And I know some people use that in different academic papers, but it is more harmful, because then what we're telling people on the outside is this group here needs to be rescued. They need to be saved. And as history has shown us, that mindset is very problematic. And we've seen that today. And I've not necessarily an emergency management way or in one of my past jobs, but I've seen someone, kind of go work with First Nation communities who's not First Nations, and really say like, okay, we're going to pay people and do this and this. And it became a lot more of a savior complex, which is really, really problematic when you start having people feel that they need you, and you're not really helping them, kind of build capacity. You're creating a lot more dependency. And so, that would be something I would warn people of, is just kind of check your motives. How do we manage balancing, acknowledging the chronic crisis within our community, within our Indigenous communities, when working with them both, to be respectful? In terms of chronic crisis, I mean, I could take an example where I was working with a community and they had one person that passed away, and within 24 hours, this was before COVID, another person passed away. And so, I was working with someone, they said, let's go to the community. And as a First Nation person, I said, we should probably tap the brakes, phone the person, say, is it even okay to come to the community? And so, because there's when communities lose someone, in micro families here in kind of the Western world, your employer might say, well, your immediate family, and they'll give you time off for maybe your parents that may have passed away, or an uncle or an aunt or a spouse. And so within First Nation communities, a lot of other cultural communities, different people raise family members. So you might have an aunt that raises someone as their own child, and so, or else maybe a cousin that raises someone or is very close to them in mentoring. So we need to understand community perspectives. Back in November last year, in a very short period of time, I had lost 10 people, 9 people to COVID, and one person through other health complications. And so that was really hard for me. And I was in the middle of work. I would take 15 minutes and go and kind of just go for a walk. I'd come back, and I needed to take a little more time off and just kind of try and like make sense of everything, losing that many people in such a short period of time that, because of COVID, I can't even go to their funerals. And so, that was hard. And because the workload was so high, and it wasn't that my employer wasn't considerate of me or anything like that, but trying to just have that conversation of why it's so personal to me, because that's my chief's brother. And if, and there's a quote that says, the hurt of one is the hurt of all, and the honor of one is the honor of all. And so in some aspect, we're all connected. And so, maybe employers could have try and have a better understanding of that kinship and that community aspect. Because when there is crisis, it might be suicide. There's one young person that passed away from my community years ago, and I'm sure my community is still dealing with that, because they were really just a really good person. And so it was a freak accident and on a four-wheeler, and so people are still grieving. And so when you factor in historic, like residential schools, and then you factor in different consultants coming through the reserve and coming there for profit, and then really derailing good relationships with the community. So that could be a form of a crisis that has been created that didn't need to exist. Then you have suicide, and then you have people leaving the community for different opportunities. So there's a lot of crises on top of crises. Then you factor in natural disasters. So what I would say is of course I would recommend to anyone, try and have an understanding of what triggers people. And it could be simple as language. Some language you shouldn't use, and so it's always just good practice just to say to a community, what's your preference. There is one where I've seen people come to communities and to my reserve and say, here's tobacco, and the community is Christian based, and so there's ways to really kind of start off on the wrong foot. So it's always just good practice just to say, what would be your preference as a customer greeting to an elder or to someone? I would recommend that.
Yeah, that's awesome, because like just speaking from my own experience, when I was quite young, I took a federal government student work experience program job. And so being young and naive and raised to think of Indigenous people as unproductive, lazy, non-contributors of society, that's the way I was raised in Alberta. It was the job I went into, and a lot of family, I look back at this and I'm like, wow, it was to travel to First Nation communities all the way from Haida Gwaii to God's Lake, Manitoba, and help the members of the community get their personal acquisition license for long guns. And so here's this, like, I don't know, I think I was like 26 at the time, young, naive, white kid from Alberta going on to First Nations to say, hey, I'm rescuing you. You're all going to get a free long gun license. Like, I did not understand the impact of that on the communities. However, not one of the 45 First Nations that I visited and worked with ever said anything that indicated disrespect. They were very welcoming. I got invited into a lot of homes of elders, and I bought a ton of art off them because they were all like, we need money for a new fishing net. We need money to get our artist tools back, whatever it is. And I look back on that experience a lot and just say, wow, what a way for the government to kind of come into a community and tell Indigenous how to have to manage their guns when really it's their traditional right to hunt. So your whole conversation there, based on the question from Shauna, I think was just, I'm hoping people really listen and reflect on what you're saying so they can sort of approach communities in a good way to support them better. Yeah. So yeah, and thanks, Shauna, for that question. Really appreciate it.
And I want to touch base with what Shauna said here, and I really appreciate having dialogue, because sometimes I can talk, and so when there's some questions, and if I don't want to say I didn't probably answer it correctly, but and really understanding challenges. So historically, I mean, it's really good to understand, the community portfolio. So, go to Indigenous Services Canada to look at their demographics pages, look at the website, look at the social media to understand, sort of get a good idea of the community. But in terms of challenges and trauma, so I mean, one thing I always try and keep in my mind is I have my experience. I know different things about certain different communities just based off of just they call it the moccasin telegraph back home. But in terms of challenges, I mean, understanding if a community has been evacuated for a number of years. And so there's one community where I can think of that was evacuated for a number of years into an urban setting and then got relocated back home to their community. And so the reserve was moved away from where it was previously. All the homes were demolished and new ones were rebuilt. And so, we really have to understand that as, for some folks, that would consider that as a win. People are back home, they have shelter, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs are met. But then you have to also consider those young children who have been born outside of a community in an urban population, who've made friends within the cities or wherever they are, coming back home to, living in the country and living in a foreign world kind of thing like that, and telling them just to, live life and be kids. And that's a real culture shock for children. There's a lot of disappointment, and also at the same time, there's not as many options for programming in the country or in communities that they may have had access to in cities. So really got to understand, community members when they say there's no resources, and that's so true. I mean, one thing when I worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I had met a lot of therapists who would kind of come into a community, and they would be there for a week and engage with members, and then they would go to the next fly-in community. And, as people might say, that's a win. And certainly people, that is a win that you have someone to talk to, in my opinion. But you need to also develop that relationship. So when communities don't have, constant resources or good access to medical attention, that becomes traumatic at the same time, right? If you have to travel 6 hours once a week for dialysis, that's a lot. That could be traumatic in itself, just taking that trip, especially if it's you have to hitch a ride, and then understanding that person may not have a vehicle, so now they might have to catch a ride with someone from the reserve to a city, and we'll just pick on Manitoba for this one. If that person doesn't live in the same household, now they could get stopped by the police because they don't live in the same household. Now they're breaking the law, and so that becomes traumatic, and so we're adding trauma to trauma to trauma. So we really have to understand the scenarios of individuals. One of the communities that I had worked with before, there's a lot of distrust with people who are coming from the city as consultants, and so when we talk about suicide and we talk about those different factors that impact communities, but also impact every community and demographic out there. There was one where I had sat in on a presentation, which was pretty much the final phase of a proposal to build a new school, and the person had downsized from the previous school. Said, we're going to have, instead of 2 classrooms, like 1 teacher per two grades, we're going to have 1 teacher per 4 grades and everyone in the one classroom. So then you only need 2 teachers and you need a smaller school. And so, asking questions at the end of the presentation to the consultant that did it, from very as a kind of a co-consultant or something like this, to a very reputable firm, I said, where did you get your data from? And, because something doesn't sit well with me. And they said, well, I looked at the statistics. I applied suicide and I applied dropout rates for people with the surrounding reserves. And that's how I derived with using that formula in using SPSS or whatever they were using to make my recommendation. And it's a sound recommendation. And so I kind of thought to myself, you didn't talk to anyone about their challenges, why they left the reserve in the first place. Maybe it was because the old school was too small and didn't have the resources. Maybe there wasn't enough spaces for programming and they wanted to get their kids to, sports, enrolled in sports. And so the person single-handedly, through their recommendation and their research, that they didn't engage with anyone. So they built the school at the end of the day. They still did it. Now all those children who are there now have to take classes with 4 or 3 other grades and compete for one teacher's time. And so now teachers who may come off from the reserve, from whatever, graduating from whatever program, university or college, are going to come there and, out of frustration, this child is delinquent. They are frustrating, they're stubborn, and start really kind of saying, well, these kids all need to be saved. And, some of them just will never make it, and actually telling children that. So that is added trauma. So we really have to understand the full implications of recommendations because consultants have a lot of power. That's one of the things where I would say tone and power have a lot of play a lot in terms of triggering and also creating some really negative self-reflections or feelings, to the person that's receiving them.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a lot to unpack, and dependent on where people's unlearning and learning is, and understanding of indigenous communities and culture, some people are going to be very familiar with that type of thing and everything you just said. Some might be sitting there in astonishment because, like, when you say resources, we're not. I mean, yeah, an emergency management resource is great: trucks, helicopters, people, radios, whatever. But in a First Nations Indigenous context, we're actually talking about water. We're actually talking about potable water. I mean, I sat in community halls where young mothers would come in with their infants with Pepsi in the baby bottle because that's all there was available to drink. Like, there was no formula. Maybe there was milk, but it was definitely 30, 40 times the price of a bottle of Pepsi. So yeah, when you say no resources, you kind of have, and you know what, that story about the school, that would never happen in a municipality. Like it would just never happen. The MLA would get involved and the MP would probably get involved, and they would use their political and social ties to squash that right away. And that would just never happen. But again, yeah, we allow it in an Indigenous context. So that onion, I guess, I don't know if an onion is the best way to describe it, but that onion of trauma down from the personal level to the community level is got a lot of layers. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Again, and sorry, I meant to say too, I'll talk to Amara about this, but when I had your name ticker come up, there was an L in your name, but I got that out. So that was, I apologize for not having the right name of the spelling of your last name in there correctly. I don't know if you noticed. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. You still got audio?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So where, in terms of research, talk to us a little bit about some of the ongoing research, because I know some of the questions that I had, we came up live stream was around research going on and maybe something that you're doing or out of the Confederacy. But what can you tell us about what kind of research is going on right now?
Yeah, so in terms of research, some of the projects that we're leading, and so we haven't connected with any post-secondary academic institutions or anything. So it's all led within the capacities and resources that we have access to within the organization. So some might be around, again, that third-party co-management, just doing a deep dive into what that policy is, and just people starting to have that conversation and just building capacity, not just for First Nation people, but also for government. Some of the other research is around capacity, or not capacity, it's around succession planning. And so looking at that and saying, what is it that the community needs? And so often I was talking with someone and said, we're really good at passing on our traditional knowledge. And sometimes, one of the things that we don't always consider is the succession planning of administrative roles. And so when, you take a disaster and a pandemic like COVID, there's people who work in those roles. And like I said, they wear many different hats, so they don't have the luxury to do strategic planning, or maybe there's no budget there to hire a third-party consultant to come facilitate this type of stuff. And so when I've seen this happen within the community back in October last year, where the person who was the band manager passed away very abruptly from COVID. And so all that knowledge went with the person. So what we're doing is researching what are some best practices, what are the tools that could support communities so they can do this type of work on their own, and at least start, instead of just saying, oh, we'll tackle this in 2 years if we can get funding. People can start, with these easy steps today. Some of the other work is around what's working well within community relationships with Alberta Emergency Management Agency, and we've heard some really good feedback in terms of the working relationship with field liaisons coming out to the communities. They like that. They like to have that personal interaction. Some of the other work that we're looking at and down the road, but will be around what marketing methods work best. And so, through some of the speaker series that we've done, really saying, like, yes, there's Facebook, but then Facebook could also turn into, just like for anything, could turn into negative, have a lot of negative components when people start commenting. You see that on Twitter also. So looking at what works well, what kind of marketing materials, posters work well, what do people want to see from the community to convince them to say this is worth spending my time. Looking at, we have Zoom and we have WebEx. Working with communities who may not have strong bandwidth, but we've learned so far through research is don't do WebEx because it's a challenge to sign in, and you need a credential or you need to download software. And so that we're learning, don't go through those. Even Zoom, we do use Zoom for our sessions. However, what we're doing now as a result of just research and having those conversations is we stream on YouTube live, so people can access it from their smartphones. They can play it while they're working, and they can play it in the background, and they can jump on there and chat at the same time. So what we're doing is really, through the research, is removing barriers for people to participate. And I think, in my opinion, that's a big win. Some of the other research is just finding out what people need. And so, as simple as templates are, and I think people probably have laughed at me because they kind of just assume those processes exist already. And for a lot of people who are new to a role, those processes might not have existed. There's disaster emergency managers where all the knowledge is in their head, and they are a really great asset. However, if there's no processes written down, we lose that knowledge when people retire, or else they move on to a new role. So I think through just those engagements of asking what their needs are, and of course, we can go and say, like, what are your needs? And they say, of course, a fire truck, a helicopter, all the physical items that they could benefit every community would want. I don't have that luxury to go and buy those items for people as much as they're needed, but we're looking at some of the tangible process and policy clauses that they could use that would benefit them, and just make life a little easier. One of the projects I would hope that we could pursue in the future is looking at large-scale evacuations when people leave one community and go to the next neighboring community who may not welcome them. And so in terms of, they go to a hotel, there's pre-existing stereotypes, as you've said before, and I grew up in a small rural town. That was nothing new to me. I've heard it all and heard it directly to my face numerous times. And so, when there's a disaster, people go back to their community, to the neighboring community, and experience a significant amount of racism. As I said, hard times breed just a lot of frustrations. And so, what can hotels do, through senior managers and kind of up the food chain to sort of say, we need to have a better relationship, because we're just, that single parent might have 5 kids, and we say we don't allow that in our hotel. But, in this situation, that's a resource that needs. So you can't demonize someone who's just trying to survive and has been evacuated from their community. So we want to do some research around that and just figure out, bring industry together, bring government together, and bring communities and find collaborative solutions that can work. But it has to be, in those cases, has to be a company kind of CEO, senior management, trickle down effect, because it can't be the frontline worker at the hotel that makes policy changes.
Yeah, and so thanks, Phil. Yeah, evacuation plans are important. 2018 BC fires, I remember in Alberta during the Slave Lake fires, there were some hotels that would not let First Nations people in. Like, simple as that. They just said no. Because what automatically came to their head was, well, they're not going to pay, or they're going to damage the room, or they're just not going to be responsible. And it was like, anyway, so we could go on that forever. But yeah, those are the hidden challenges that are out there where you need support. Indigenous communities all over Canada need that support. And Phil is seeing it in BC. It's probably a common theme anywhere. I think even I remember in Manitoba, because Alberta, like, I don't want to call it luck, but there's been a lot of work put into the contractor agreement with, the federal government, Alberta government, and the First Nations through the First Nation Field Officer program to come up with some agreements, whereas other provinces, those don't exist. And I remember Manitoba, they're probably still the same way. Like, they forever would resist that type of agreement. And there were First Nation communities still living evacuated after the 2010 floods in like 2017. Because the government just said, no, we're not going to help and support the evacuees or help build the homes. And they were out of the community for like 5 or 6 or 7 years. Like, just horrible stories like that.
Yeah, one of the challenges what I've seen in some of the situations, I mean, where there's emergency where everyone wants to be there, hands on deck. People will support, and I just had a chat with Bob Benson yesterday about this. And after in the States, they have disaster after disaster, and FEMA is stretched thin with people working so dedicatedly right across the state. Whether you have you have hurricane season, you have the building collapse in Miami now. I think it's in Miami, somewhere in Florida. And you have Miami, drought effects down in California region. And so people are stretched thin, and tornadoes happen. And within communities, we see people as, okay, now you're back home, the problem's over. You have your needs met, you have shelter, you have food, you have water. Yeah. And so one of the things that, I think it would be a really important area to research and collaboratively with a community is to find out what sort of resources are needed for the recovery. Because again, like I said, like you may have had some structures in place before the disaster, doesn't mean you're going to have them after. You might not have that sports complex, which is a good outlet for kids. You may have people who in the cities out of depression, sitting in a hotel for years, evacuated, get addicted to substances, and because it would be depressing. Imagine your MLA, imagine your insurance company, imagine coordinators not talking to you, and the only people you have is the people of your community to advocate for you. Any person, if your house burned down, you would expect your insurance person to be talking to you, and you'd expect it to find a good solution, and everyone working really fast to get you back home. Isn't the case for First Nation people. And so you have to understand those challenges. Back to Sean, so that point is you have to understand those are really frustrating circumstances. If this world that has been set up saying we're going to take care of First Nation communities through our policy, through legislation, isn't talking to the direct people who are impacted. They only want to talk to the chief and council behind closed doors. So it creates a lot of skepticism, creates a lot of frustration. And again, it just triggers people back to going to that places. Government doesn't value us. They won't even talk to us. They only want to talk to the chief and council. We've seen this before, and clearly it didn't work before. It's not going to work now. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of resentment, but that resentment would be in every facet of a city. People would be frustrated. Look, I mean, if there's a zoning for an urban reserve, people are frustrated because they're scared of the unknown. So people are going to expect some sort of response from their governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. So I know I kind of wanted to touch on this too. And again, if you've got questions for Ken, please shoot them in the comments. We'll get them. But I also wanted to kind of highlight some of your art.
Oh, thank you.
Because I only started following you on Twitter recently, and this was kind of one of the first, one of the main pieces that you just did. Well, let me bring you back in here. What's the best view for this? Let's see. This one here. We'll stick with it. So, like, kind of walk me, if you don't mind, walk me through this piece of art, because there's, in First Nation art, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of, small, finite details. And I'll bring it up large so people can see it, but kind of walk us through, what animal is in here and some of the symbols that we can see, like in the middle there. I think it's, I don't want to get the names wrong, but.
Yeah, you know what? I'm a doodler. And throughout high school, throughout university, and probably a lot of conferences, I doodled a lot. And people would be frustrated with me and get frustrated until I watched a TED Talk, and when I learned that people who doodle are really creative people, and they still can listen. So I was glad to be validated by someone's TED Talk for people who are like me. But in terms of this picture, I mean, we have a teepee, we have a bird, we have trees. We have some beadwork. We have a circle, which kind of shows that the connection is, every direction. Everything is connected. And I think, through a lot of the other artwork that I'm putting out there is just that message is everything is connected. The world of emergency managers, and I'm not saying I can speak for emergency managers, but the people who are in that profession, and all the other players, social services, fire, EMS work, police work, social workers, doctors, everyone is connected. And so really throughout this artwork is just to showcase the connectedness of everything. It's some of the other artwork I've put up there. And so this one was made out of pen, and it's very fine art. It's the size of maybe the bottom of a coffee cup, this one.
Okay. So it's small. It looks big on here, but it's smaller. Yeah. But you've got okay. So is it correct in saying that this is a beak of a bird?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Beak. So a predator.
It would be a bird, and within the bird, you have a smaller bird that's kind of looking upwards. Yeah. You have some different symbolism. So you have some underneath the bird there. You have trees.
Yeah.
And so it kind of inspired from a headdress for this one, some feathers, some smaller feathers in the background, and connected to it. And it is small on my end, so I can't really see some of the details there. But yeah, just again, just showing everything is connected. With some of the other work, and I've seen some really amazing work out there from other Indigenous artists, but I think in terms of, for the example, this one here, again, this one I just did last night. Again, everything is connected. The teepee in this one here represents a woman, grandmother, and so it's pointing up towards the stars, and so that would be that one. And again, everything is connected. And it's so much so true with our climate and with the environment. You know, what happens in BC, you know, whether it's a fire or a earthquake, we're all affected. We're all impacted. Maybe not physically, but there's the supply chains that get impacted. Again, this one's an urban Indigenous kind of take on pop art, and so just some different styles. So here you have a teepee in the middle that's kind of buried within the background. Cities are warm. You can see maybe some lines coming down just above the green there, which kind of just represents the heat capacity that cities can produce. Cars going through bridges, but then again, this one right here in the corner, you have a fellow here, kind of looks like a Monopoly guy with a big mustache.
Oh yeah.
And just kind of looking down, frustrated. So yeah, this one was just more for fun. And one of the things, I guess, in terms of what art means to me, and I know that's probably not why people signed up here, but in terms of, we're all busy, we all have our pain points of what we do, and it's so critical to have those outlets. So for me, art is my outlet. As much as I say I ride my bike, my exercise bike, I don't, but art is far more my outlet. But you know, when you're working with your teams, we talk about burnout, we talk about stress, we talk about kind of hitting your capacity of you know, we just went through, well, we're still in COVID. We have a financial crisis. We have environmental crisis. We have glooming layoffs. There's so much happening in this world, and we have no control. And so for me, art is that one little aspect that I can control. It's a creative outlet. And I just started sharing it online just to, you know, maybe someone find some messaging or meeting out of it that maybe I didn't even intend for it to be. But yeah, no, there's a lot of really good people out there with good capacities. There's people here in the chat that have some really strong gifts, and I'm sure that not everyone kind of recognizes that. And so, you know, when we talk about burnout and we talk about the psychology of just hitting our max limitations, we need to just take some time out there. And regardless if you're working with First Nation people or just your team in a city center, just giving your colleagues a little praise for what they do. For maybe they just develop something as small as a new process on a template, and you know, that big change for someone who has to fill that template out, or maybe those recommendations. So you know, and employers, managers, just, I think we can all do a little better in terms of just thanking our staff for what they do, because people do a lot. And so my gift is art. Someone else might be leadership. Someone might be a motivational speaker, or can look at policy or writing, and that's their gift. And so in the world of emergency management, there's so much talent out there. And part of the speaker series, I wanted to capture that. We talked about, from a legal perspective, about procurement to briefing notes. The world is big, and the talents and capacities are amazing out there. So we just need to start kind of embracing the people who have those different skill sets, and just thanking them for being on this journey with us. Awesome.
That is awesome. That's all I'll say. Like, yeah, thank you. That's pretty powerful. To have that conversation about art and creativity and talent in emergency management, I think I agree with you. It's overdue. And, you know, that was part, you know, it's like going back to what you said, like in Indigenous engagement, it's getting to understand what you just said about the meaning of art in the community and creativity in order to create that relationship. So Thank you for letting me share that on here. I really appreciate you putting yourself out there, letting us kind of look at your art online here live, and kind of walking us through some of the meaning. I'm getting that understanding of where you're coming from as an artist and how it plays into your life and work helps us create that relationship. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Okay. All right, sir. Well, I will. I want to say thank you again. Any closing words for everyone out there from you?
I see much overdue. For me, just thank you so much, and for everyone for just investing some time to listen to me. I know for the past couple of weeks, everyone has probably seen my face on LinkedIn to some capacity, promoting the events, and we're really proud of that. We've had such amazing reach right across every treaty region here in Alberta, but right across Canada and around the world too, even as far as away from New Zealand and Australia and throughout the States. So, but thanks so much. I really am humbled that you were able to join us today and, like I said, listen to me kind of just go on in my tangents. But your time to invest in the session was great, and I hope that you walk away with one or two aha moments.
I have a feeling there's a lot of people listening right now and in the coming recording who are going to have a lot of aha moments. So, all right, Ken, thank you very much. We will talk to you later. I'm going to do the closing here and I'll come back. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. We will be back next week with Autism Canada, talking about emergency social services and autism. And we'll be with the author of Public Speaking for Dummies, Allison Connolly, coming up. Stay connected.